Paula Pant, the host of the Afford Anything podcast, likes to answer questions her listeners send in. This is a special episode where she also has Joe Saul-Sehy from the Stacking Benjamins show join in the fun.
Hi Paula, in your show you've talked about avoiding lifestyle inflation, but what if you want or need some lifestyle inflation? My husband and I have been talking about how as your work life changes, you sometimes end up spending more money because you have fewer free hours or less flexibility. For instance, when we get busy, we often end up ordering out or buying convenience food, which is more expensive than cooking ourselves. We've also always shared one car, but now my new job outside the city and having a 1-year-old makes sharing a car increasingly difficult, and we're thinking about buying a second. There's also things like new work clothes that you might need if you're given a promotion. For me, I've been a graduate student for the past 5 years, and now I'm going to be a professor, so I can't exactly wear leggings anymore to work. So when you have some of these lifestyle inflations mandated on you, how do you keep other areas of inflation in check? And how do you recognize the ones that are legitimate? And relatedly, when there's opportunities to make money that come up that may cause lifestyle inflation or extra personal expenses, like if you have to pay for extra childcare or if you are going to end up buying dinner out because you have less free time to cook for yourself, how do you make sure that you are considering those costs into the rates that you're willing to accept extra work for? Thanks so much for your thoughts.
I love this question. I also don't have a problem with lifestyle inflation. Here's what I have a problem with. I have a problem with lifestyle inflation that you didn't realize. Like stamps cost how much now? You know, or what? Is that an old guy analogy? Does anybody use stamps anymore?
Well, I think, Joe, that's, the rising cost of goods is actual inflation, but lifestyle inflation is when you yourself make the decision, whether it's a conscious decision or just something that you kind of accidentally do not accidentally, but something that you mindlessly do. Lifestyle inflation is when you raise your standard of living to reflect your means.
Yeah, but there is a fantastic commercial on right now about retirement. I don't remember which one of the big firms has it, but it's this financial advisor sitting on a sofa with a woman. He says, "So what do you want to do now?" And she said, "Well, we're talking about retirement, I thought." He's like, "Yeah, we are. What do you want to do now?" She said, "Well, aren't we supposed to be talking about what I want to do later?" "Yeah, we'll get to that. But what do you want to do now?" And I think that too many people put off the now stuff because they're so worried about later. There's a simple equation that I like, which is your future goals cost X amount of money times Y return equals the goal. So once I know what the goal is and I know how much money I'm saving toward it, I can then solve for the rate of return that I need, which, by the way, then takes this huge amount of investments that are out there that I might have to research. And all of a sudden it becomes this really, really small group of investments that I need to look at. And all of a sudden this huge problem that I had looking at my investment strategy becomes much, much easier. But in this case, if she knows that equation for her future goals, then she'll be able to know how much she can raise her lifestyle by and not have it, not have a problem and not have to worry about, is she mortgaging her future, which I think is a big part of her question.
Right, exactly. Laura, the other way that you could approach this is to determine, if you aren't sure exactly what your future goals are, and you know that you generally want to be saving money, you don't know exactly why. You don't know if you are going to want to take a sabbatical in 10 years or buy a second home. You don't know what that is, but you know that it's a good idea to give yourself more options and choices. Then the approach that you could take is to decide that any raise that you get, you will save X amount of that raise and then spend the other X amount of that raise. So for example, and I'm just pulling numbers out of thin air, you could decide that if you got some type of a raise, a half of that raise would go into savings automatically, and then the other half you can just spend and live on and relax about. So that is one of many possible approaches. The way that I would approach each of those individual decisions is by asking yourself if there is if there's an alternative approach that would not take up too much of your time or mental bandwidth. Because remember, time and mental bandwidth are in extremely short supply, and I often argue that time is more valuable than money. It's more limited. It's a much more limited asset. And so depending on where you live and depending on the public transportation in your area, going from one car to two may make a ton of sense in terms of the time and hassle that you would save. But ordering food in from a restaurant as compared with, say, batch cooking on Sunday, that might be a way to circumvent ordering food from restaurants often, which can get very expensive. Laura, to the other part of your question, which is how to calculate the cost of lifestyle inflation when you have a side hustle. I love that aspect of your question because absolutely, when you start a side hustle, your time becomes even more compressed. And that means that you do have to spend money on additional conveniences like that extra car or childcare. I don't think that there is a specific equation that I would use. If you were to just use a straight equation that looked at the present amount of money that you are making as compared to the present amount of money that you are spending, you could run that equation and you could say, hey, I'm spending X amount more and I'm making Y amount more and the spread needs to be Z. But here's the problem. That equation does not take into account your potential to increase the variable Y. In other words, it doesn't take into account your potential to start your side hustle earning Y and eventually grow your side hustle to the point where you're earning A, B, C, D.
Yeah.
If that is your goal, if your side hustle is something that excites you enough that you want to grow it and almost treat it like a secondary career.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Yeah. That's one thing that took me a long time to figure out. It took me a long time to really connect with that idea. Because, I'll just give an example from my own life. When you start a blog or you start a podcast or you start any type of creative outlet like this, in the beginning, you make zero. Like in the beginning, you lose money as you're pouring your time and your resources into it. And then eventually you get to zero. And then eventually it grows. But if I were just looking at that, if I were judging it based on what I was making from hour one, it would be a terrible idea. Heck, if I were judging it from what I made at hour 100, it would still be a terrible idea.
I had a mentor one time who used an analogy, and I don't know that it's a great analogy, but it's visual, which I like. And he says, you're at a casino and you're playing for X number of chips, and you can either take your chips, is a horrible analogy, right? You can either take that number of chips and go home, or you can push those chips back across the table and say, nope, I'm playing a bigger game than this. And I've always thought about that in the early days of creating, whatever business it is that I've created, because I've had 5 different businesses I've created. And every time I think, is this a level I want to play at? Or do I want to reinvest more to play on a bigger stage? And I push those back and say, nope, we're going to play bigger ball than this.
Right. And that's the thing is, and this does get a little slippery slope, but to an extent, the additional money that you spend on giving yourself the time and energy to have a side hustle is in some way an investment that you are making in the growth of that company. And again, it is a judgment call how slippery slope you get, because you don't want to reach the point where you're justifying every convenience purchase.
Right. You have to look at the ROI on the decision, the return on investment, right? Ahead of time. I think you have to apply some math ahead of time.
Except I don't know how you could. Because I don't think it's right to apply that math based on what you would currently make. So, one of the ways that I think of it is if I realize I'm going to have to up my spending game, I start to think of what would it take within this business for me to earn that back. So, for example, I have a membership to a co-working space. And right now, the membership that I have is $100 a month, and that gives me access from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. I want to increase that membership up to the next level, which costs $250 a month, and that will give me 24-hour access to that co-working space. Now, what I have found is that I am much more productive in the co-working space, far more productive than I am at coffee shops or at libraries. And of course, being naturally frugal, I'm resistant to the idea of spending an extra $150 a month. I'm resistant to the idea of spending that just to have evening and weekend access to this space. It feels like it doesn't make sense when I could easily just go to a coffee shop during those hours. Or it especially feels like it doesn't make sense when I look ahead at months where I'm hardly even going to be home anyway. I'm going to be going to conferences or going to this or that, and I won't even be home for a big part of that month. And I know that that money will, largely not be used. But the way that I kind of came to peace with that decision is I thought to myself, all right, what would it take to earn an extra $150 in my business? Not that much. And so that was when I realized I was unnecessarily sweating the small stuff.
Right.
Hey, did you enjoy this excerpt from the Afford Anything podcast? Then be sure to subscribe to Paula's YouTube channel. Not only is every podcast episode and Ask Paula question released here on YouTube, other creative deep thought videos are created just for you. Remember, you can watch anything, just not everything. Fill your YouTube viewing time with more videos to make you think and grow so you can afford anything. Go ahead, hit that little red subscribe button. We'll take care of the rest.